Imagine a different kind of World War II, one where Adolf Hitler, after his stunning victories across Western Europe in 1940, stepped back from day-to-day military command and allowed his generals to fight the war the way they had been trained. No raging interference in operational decisions, no overruling commanders at the critical moment, no insisting on holding positions until entire armies were destroyed. What might have happened if the men who had delivered France's defeat in 6 weeks, who had driven to the English Channel and left the entire British Expeditionary Force scrambling for survival at Dunkirk, had been allowed to continue applying their professional judgment without constant interference from a man who had been, in another life, a corporal? Would Germany have won the war? Would the war have ended differently, perhaps in a negotiated peace? Or would the same fundamental contradictions and strategic overreach that doomed the Third Reich have produced a similar collapse, regardless? In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into this remarkable and haunting question by examining the generals themselves, the decisions that were made, the decisions that were overruled, and what the evidence suggests might have unfolded if military expertise had been allowed to prevail over ideological obsession. So, without further ado, let's start from the very beginning. To understand what might have changed, we first need to understand who these men were and what made them extraordinary military professionals. The German officer corps that led the Wehrmacht into battle had been shaped by nearly 200 years of Prussian military tradition, reformed after the catastrophic defeat of 1806, rebuilt through the brutal crucible of World War I, and secretly kept alive through the limitations of the Versailles Treaty. These were not simply brave men, they were professional military thinkers who had spent their entire careers studying the art and science of war. They had developed doctrines of flexible command, of exploitation of breakthroughs, of rapid movement and initiative. Concepts that would later be called blitzkrieg, though the Germans themselves rarely used that term, had emerged from this tradition. The 1940 campaign in France was in many ways the high watermark of their capabilities. A campaign in which professional military judgment was allowed to operate with relative freedom, and the results were staggering. France, the dominant continental military power of its era, with the largest army in Western Europe, collapsed in 46 days. But something shifted after 1940. Hitler, intoxicated by victory and increasingly convinced that his own instincts had been responsible for German successes, began to insert himself more and more aggressively into operational decisions. He overruled his generals on questions of where to attack, when to halt, whether to retreat, which cities to hold, which armies to reinforce. The list of interventions is staggering in both its breadth and its consequences. And as we examine each of the major turning points of the war, the question that emerges again and again is, what would these men have done differently, and would it have mattered? The first name we must consider is Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the German army from 1938 to 1941. Born into a military family with deep roots in Prussian military tradition, Brauchitsch had built a career spanning decades and 2 world wars. His strategic expertise had been central to the successful blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940. He oversaw the key operations in Poland, France, and the Low Countries, and under his operational direction, those campaigns had unfolded with a precision and speed that shocked the world. Brauchitsch understood something that Hitler never truly grasped, which was that logistics, supply lines, and the conservation of fighting strength were just as important as tactical boldness. He understood that an army that outruns its supply cannot sustain its victories, and that troops who have fought without rest or reinforcement will eventually break no matter how fierce their initial momentum. His relationship with Hitler deteriorated steadily as the Führer's confidence in his own military instincts grew. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 brought these tensions to a head in ways that would prove catastrophic for Germany. The fundamental dispute between Brauchitsch and Hitler over the direction of Operation Barbarossa is one of the most consequential arguments in military history, and it is one where the weight of professional opinion rests clearly on one side. Brauchitsch, along with most of his senior commanders, believed that the primary objective of Barbarossa should be Moscow. The Soviet capital was not merely a symbolic target. It was the hub of the Soviet road and rail network, the center of Soviet political control, and a place that Stalin himself could not afford to lose. The capture of Moscow would sever the Soviet capacity to move reinforcements and supplies across the enormous theater of operations, and it would represent a political blow of potentially war-ending magnitude. Hitler overruled this assessment. In August 1941, with the German advance in the Central Theatre making spectacular progress and Moscow seemingly within reach, Hitler issued his infamous Directive No. 34, diverting the bulk of the German armour from Army Group Centre toward the south to participate in the Kiev encirclement and toward the north to assist in the siege of Leningrad. The professional military consensus, expressed by Brauchitsch, by Halder, by Guderian, by Bock, was that this diversion was a catastrophic error. They argued, correctly as events would prove, that the diversion of forces in August 1941 would cost Germany the window of opportunity to strike Moscow before winter arrived. Guderian flew to Hitler's headquarters personally to argue against the diversion, an almost unheard-of act of professional defiance, and was overruled. The Kiev operation was a brilliant tactical success. More than 660,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in one of the largest encirclements in military history. But by the time German forces could regroup and reorient toward Moscow, it was late September. Operation Typhoon, the attack on Moscow, began on October 2, 1941, weeks later than the generals had wanted. The autumn rains then turned the Russian roads to impassable mud, and when the ground finally froze and the advance resumed in November, the German troops were fighting without adequate winter equipment, in temperatures that dropped to 30 and 40 degrees below zero, against a Soviet defense that had been reinforced with fresh divisions transferred from Siberia by a Soviet commander who knew, thanks to his spy networks, that Japan would not attack in the east. The attack faltered just kilometers from Moscow. Brauchitsch, his health deteriorating after a heart attack in November 1941, was dismissed by Hitler in December. He would never command again. He was arrested by British forces in August 1945, charged with war crimes, and held for 3 years awaiting trial. Fate, however, had other plans. On October 18, 1948, just as he was set to face prosecution, Brauchitsch died of pneumonia. The man who had once commanded Hitler's armies would never answer for his actions in a court of law. But the question that history asks about Brauchitsch is not merely what happened to him after the war. It is what would have happened if he had been allowed to direct the 1941 campaign, according to professional military judgment. If German forces had driven directly toward Moscow in the summer and early autumn of 1941, with the full weight of the Wehrmacht's still formidable offensive power concentrated on that single objective, would the Soviet Union have collapsed? It is impossible to say with certainty, but there is a strong argument that the psychological and operational impact of losing Moscow would have been devastating to the Soviet war effort in a way that no amount of territorial conquest in Ukraine or the siege of Leningrad could replicate. Moving now to Erich von Manstein, perhaps the single most gifted operational commander produced by Germany in the entire war, a man whose professional brilliance stands in almost painful contrast to the strategic disasters that Hitler's interference made inevitable. Manstein's story begins with the plan that won France. As Chief of Staff to General Gerd von Rundstedt during the invasion of Poland in 1939, he had already demonstrated an ability to think boldly and unconventionally. But it was his proposed plan for the invasion of France that cemented his reputation as a strategic genius. The original German plan for the invasion of France, Plan Yellow in its initial form, was a relatively conventional operation that would have driven through Belgium in a manner reminiscent of the Schlieffen Plan of 1914. It was cautious, predictable, and the French were well aware that something along those lines was coming. Manstein proposed something entirely different. He proposed sending the main armoured thrust through the Ardennes forest, which the French considered impassable for armour, to strike across the Meuse River and drive directly to the English Channel coast, cutting off the Allied forces in Belgium from their supply and retreat routes. The German High Command initially rejected Manstein's plan as too risky. His ideas were so disruptive to established thinking that he was actually removed from his staff position and given command of a corps, a sideways move clearly intended to get him out of the planning process. But fate intervened in the form of a plane crash that delivered German operational plans into Allied hands, forcing a complete rethinking of the attack. Hitler, who had independently arrived at some of the same ideas as Manstein through his own instinctive aversion to conventional approaches, championed the revised plan. The result was the most successful military campaign in modern history. Manstein's genius had delivered France's defeat. What does this tell us about the question of what would have happened if the generals had been allowed to run the war? Manstein's case actually complicates the simple narrative that Hitler was always wrong and the generals always right. In 1940, Hitler supported Manstein's bold plan against conventional military resistance. But as the war progressed and the strategic situation became more desperate, the nature of Hitler's interventions shifted from sometimes bold and creative to almost uniformly destructive. The halt order at Dunkirk, issued in May 1940, is perhaps the clearest early example of Hitler overruling his generals in a way that had profound long-term consequences. The panzer commanders, men like Guderian and Kleist, wanted to press forward and destroy the Allied forces trapped on the beaches. Hitler halted the armoured advance, reportedly at the urging of Göring, who wanted the Luftwaffe to have the glory of finishing the job. The result was the Dunkirk evacuation, in which over 330,000 Allied soldiers escaped to fight another day. Those men would go on to form the nucleus of the armies that would eventually liberate Western Europe. Manstein's own wartime career illustrates the tension between military professionalism and Hitler's interference with extraordinary clarity. After commanding an infantry corps in the French campaign and achieving promotion to general in June 1940, he led the 56th Panzer Corps in the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, driving almost to Leningrad with terrifying speed. He then took command of the 11th Army on the Southern Front, capturing 430,000 Soviet prisoners and successfully resisting Soviet counteroffensives. His capture of Sevastopol in July 1942, a fortress the Soviets had held with extraordinary tenacity, earned him promotion to Field Marshal. But it was in the terrible winter crisis of 1942 to 1943, as the encirclement at Stalingrad tightened around the German 6th Army, that Manstein's operational genius truly revealed itself and where Hitler's interference proved most devastating. The question of whether the 6th Army at Stalingrad could have been saved has been debated by historians for decades. Manstein believed it could, but only if Hitler agreed to authorize a breakout. His plan was for the relief force to drive towards Stalingrad, while the 6th Army fought its way out to meet them, a pincer movement that might have saved the better part of 300,000 German soldiers. Hitler refused. He insisted that the 6th Army would hold its position and be supplied by air, a fantasy that Göring had recklessly promised could be achieved and that proved utterly impossible in the Russian winter. The 6th Army died in Stalingrad, with over 90,000 survivors surrendering in February 1943 in one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. Manstein, watching this disaster unfold from the outside, was powerless to prevent it. Would he have saved the 6th Army if given operational freedom? Possibly. And if he had, the entire trajectory of the Eastern Front war would have been different. 300,000 battle-hardened German veterans, the core of the 6th Army, would have been available to continue the fight rather than rotting in Soviet prisoner-of-war camps. After the war, Manstein was captured by the British in 1945 and stood trial for war crimes. While he was acquitted of the most serious charges, he remained imprisoned until his release due to health issues in 1953. He later served as an advisor to the West German government on army organization, a remarkable testament to the respect that his professional competence continued to command even among former enemies. His memoirs, titled Verloren Siege, meaning Lost Victories, were published to widespread acclaim, and he passed away in 1973. The title of those memoirs captures something essential about the entire question we are examining in this video. These were victories that were lost, not because Germany lacked the military talent to win them, but because that talent was systematically overruled, undermined, and ultimately destroyed by the man who claimed to be directing the war. Now let us turn to Heinz Guderian, the architect of Germany's armoured doctrine and perhaps the most innovative military thinker of the 20th century. Guderian had essentially invented modern armoured warfare. He had written the book on it, literally, in his 1937 work Achtung Panzer, which laid out the theory of concentrated armoured breakthroughs supported by mobile infantry and air power that would become the signature military method of the Second World War. He had then put those theories into practice with devastating effect. During the Polish campaign of 1939, his 19th Panzer Corps had advanced with a speed that left even his own high command struggling to process what was happening. In France in 1940, he had driven his corps through the supposedly impassable Ardennes, crossed the Meuse at Sedan in a day when the conventional military estimate was that it would take at minimum 9 days to force that crossing, and then driven for the Channel with an audacity that bordered on recklessness but produced spectacular results. Guderian later admitted to being impressed by the American General George Patton, saying of him, "I hear much about General Patton, and he conducted a good campaign. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory, since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." This is a remarkable statement, and it tells us something important about Guderian. He was a man who recognized excellence in others and who evaluated military operations according to professional criteria rather than ideological ones. He was not a political soldier in the way that some others were. He was a professional military thinker who happened to serve in Germany's army. His relationship with Hitler was characteristically troubled. In August 1941, as we have already noted, Guderian flew personally to Hitler's headquarters to argue against the diversion of armour away from the Moscow Axis. He was overruled. Later, during the crisis battles of the winter of 1941 to 1942, Guderian authorised unauthorised withdrawals to shorten the German line and preserve his forces, judgments that any competent military professional would recognise as necessary, but that Hitler viewed as unacceptable. He was relieved of his command in December 1941 and spent over a year in effective exile before being recalled to serve as Inspector General of Armoured Troops in February 1943. He was then appointed Chief of the Army General Staff in July 1944 in the aftermath of the July 20th assassination attempt, a position in which he would spend the last year of the war in increasingly futile attempts to persuade Hitler to adopt rational military strategies, efforts that were uniformly unsuccessful. The question of what Guderian might have achieved with genuine operational freedom is tantalizing. His fundamental insight that armoured forces should be used in concentrated masses to punch through enemy lines and drive deep into rear areas to disrupt command and logistics, rather than being spread across the front to support infantry, was not fully appreciated even by the German High Command in the early stages of the war, let alone later when Hitler began to insist on using tanks as fixed defensive weapons. The debates over armoured doctrine that Guderian had with both Hitler and more conservative German generals throughout the war represent a consistent pattern of professional military wisdom being overridden by institutional conservatism and political interference. What might his concentrated armoured forces have achieved on the Eastern Front? In the summer of 1942, if they had not been fragmented across multiple diverging axes of advance, split between the drive toward Stalingrad and the drive toward the Caucasus oil fields in a strategic overreach that stretched German logistics beyond the breaking point? The answer that most military historians would give is that a more concentrated operational approach in the summer of 1942, driving toward a single decisive objective with full armoured concentration, rather than the sprawling two-pronged operation that was actually attempted, might have produced a breakthrough that the Soviets could not have contained. Whether that would have been enough to end the war is a different question. The Soviet Union's capacity for absorbing punishment and rebuilding its forces had been consistently underestimated by German planners from the very beginning. But it would certainly have produced a very different military situation than the one that actually unfolded, in which both the Stalingrad drive and the Caucasus operation ended in catastrophic failure. Let us consider Gerd von Rundstedt, one of the most senior and respected commanders in the Wehrmacht, a man whose military career spanned both world wars and who was seen by many of his peers as the embodiment of the Prussian military tradition. Rundstedt had commanded Army Group South during the Polish invasion in 1939, then led Army Group A with distinction in the French campaign of 1940. He was a commander of the old school, cautious in the best sense of that word, meaning that he was careful with his men's lives and precise in his operational thinking. He did not make reckless bets. He worked with the forces and logistics he actually had rather than the forces and logistics he wished he had. His first major clash with Hitler came in December 1941 during the terrible Soviet winter counteroffensive that followed the failure to take Moscow. Rundstedt, commanding Army Group South, faced a desperate situation along the Maas River and made the professional military judgment that his forces must retreat to a defensible line. Hitler refused to authorize the retreat. Rundstedt told Hitler bluntly that if the order to hold was not withdrawn, he must ask to be relieved of his command. Hitler accepted the resignation and replaced him, then within weeks ordered the very retreat that Rundstedt had requested. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the war. A commander would recognize the military necessity of a withdrawal. Hitler would refuse. The situation would deteriorate further. Hitler would eventually authorize the withdrawal anyway, but weeks or months too late. And the result would be losses that a timely decision would have prevented. Rundstedt was recalled in 1942 to command in the West, and it was in this role that he provides us with one of the most fascinating what-if moments of the entire war. As the Allies prepared to invade Normandy in June 1944, there was a fundamental strategic disagreement between Rundstedt and Erwin Rommel about how to meet the invasion. Rommel wanted to concentrate the panzer reserves near the beaches and destroy the Allied landings in the first critical days before the Allies could consolidate their beachhead. Rundstedt wanted to hold the armoured reserves further back, maintaining operational flexibility to respond to the actual direction of the main Allied thrust once it became clear. Both positions had professional merit. Both men were among the finest military minds in the German army. What actually happened was that Hitler refused to commit the panzer reserves to either commander's plan, insisting on personal control over the reserve divisions and then delaying their commitment fatally on D-Day itself while the Allied landings consolidated. This is perhaps the clearest single example in the entire war of Hitler's interference producing a militarily indefensible outcome. Had Rommel's plan been fully implemented, the panzer divisions would have been on the beaches on June 6th. Had Rundstedt's plan been fully implemented, they would have been committed in concentrated force as soon as the strategic situation clarified. What actually happened was a compromise that served neither purpose and allowed the Allied beachhead to consolidate until it could no longer be eliminated. When Rundstedt finally recognized the impossibility of the military situation and was asked by his superior Wilhelm Keitel what Germany should do, he reportedly responded with the now famous words, "Make peace, you fools, what else can you do?" This remarkable statement, so honest and so professionally correct, resulted in his immediate dismissal. He was replaced, then recalled again, then dismissed again by Hitler in March 1945. On May 1st, the day after Hitler's suicide in Berlin, troops from the 36th Infantry Division made him a prisoner of war. During his interrogation, he faced a heart attack, reflecting the physical toll that years of operating under the impossible constraints of Hitler's interference had taken. He was charged with war crimes related to his assistance of von Reichenau's infamous severity order, which had led to mass murders in occupied Soviet territory. However, due to his advanced age and deteriorating health, he was never put on trial and was released in July 1948. He spent his retirement in Lower Saxony, troubled by heart conditions until his death on February 24, 1953. Georg von Küchler is a name that appears less frequently in popular histories of the war, but his case is deeply instructive for our purposes. Küchler joined the German army in 1900 and spent his entire adult life as a professional soldier. He gained experience during World War I and continued his service through the interwar years, specializing in artillery and accumulating the deep technical knowledge of his craft that distinguished the best German officers. By World War II, he commanded the 18th Army and later Army Group North, and it was in this latter role that his story intersects most directly with the question of what might have been different if professional military judgment had prevailed. Army Group North's primary objective in Operation Barbarossa was the capture of Leningrad. In the autumn of 1941, German forces came remarkably close to achieving this objective. The city was cut off from land resupply, its population was facing starvation, and its defenders were fighting with a desperation born of knowing there was nowhere to retreat. There are serious historians who argue that Leningrad could have been taken in late 1941 if the forces directed there had been given consistent priority and if Hitler had not repeatedly diverted units away from the Northern Theatre for operations elsewhere. Küchler was promoted to Field Marshal in 1942 and continued commanding Army Group North through the terrible siege that would eventually last 900 days. By early 1944, with the Red Army making significant advances and the siege line becoming increasingly untenable, Küchler recognized the professional military necessity of a strategic withdrawal. Hitler refused to authorize it. When Küchler persisted in his professional assessment that the current positions could not be held, Hitler relieved him of command. This pattern A professional commander recognizing military reality and Hitler refusing to acknowledge it plays out so consistently throughout the war that it begins to feel almost inevitable. Küchler's case is particularly significant because he also turned down an invitation to participate in the anti-Hitler movement, suggesting that whatever his professional disagreements with Hitler, he was not willing to take the step into outright resistance. He was a soldier doing his professional duty within a criminal system, which raises precisely the kind of moral complexity that his post-war trial would grapple with. At the end of the war, Küchler was arrested by the American army and tried in the High Command trial. He stood accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the Soviet Union, including involvement in the murder of mentally disabled individuals in occupied territories. During the proceedings, he admitted to the harsh conditions in prisoner of war camps, but attributed them primarily to winter conditions, which he described as an act of God, and claimed that the army had exaggerated mortality rates to receive more supplies. Despite these attempts to mitigate his responsibility, the court found him guilty and sentenced him to 20 years in prison. His sentence was subsequently reviewed and reduced to 12 years in 1951, and in February 1953 he was released from prison. He went on to live with his wife in the Garmisch region, passing away in Garmisch-Partenkirchen on May 25, 1968. But what does Küchler's professional judgment about the Leningrad sector tell us about the larger question of the war? If German forces had been directed by professional military judgment from the beginning, the siege of Leningrad might have been resolved one way or the other far earlier. Either the city would have been captured before Soviet defences consolidated, or the German forces besieging it would have been employed more productively elsewhere. The 900 days of siege that actually occurred represented an enormous consumption of German manpower and resources for an objective that was never achieved. From a pure military efficiency standpoint, it is difficult to construct a scenario in which professional military management of the Leningrad operation would have produced a worse outcome than what actually happened. Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb presents us with one of the most morally complex cases among the senior German commanders of the war, a man whose professional abilities were considerable, whose relationship with the Nazi regime was always somewhat uneasy, and whose post-war fate illustrated with uncomfortable clarity the limits of Allied justice when applied to high-ranking military men. Leeb had begun his service in the Bavarian army and rose through the ranks during World War I, where he distinguished himself as a capable officer, earning several medals including the prestigious military order of Max Joseph, which granted him a noble title, and the prefix Ritter, meaning knight, in his surname. He was a Catholic conservative who had at various points expressed private reservations about aspects of National Socialist policy, but like most senior officers, he ultimately served the regime he had private doubts about. Leeb commanded Army Group C during the invasion of France in 1940, playing a key role in the rapid defeat of French forces and earning promotion to Field Marshal. On March 30th, 1941, he was among over 200 senior military officers who attended a speech delivered by Adolf Hitler, in which Hitler detailed his vision for an ideological war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. Whatever private reservations Leeb may have had, he attended that meeting, heard those orders, and then carried them out. During Operation Barbarossa, Leeb was assigned to lead Army Group North with the mission of advancing through the Baltic states and capturing Leningrad. His forces were implicated in war crimes against civilians, cooperating closely with SS Einsatzgruppen, responsible for mass executions, particularly targeting the Jewish population. Leeb was also involved in transmitting the Barbarossa Decree, which authorized the killing of Soviet political commissars and the harsh treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. On January 15, 1942, Leeb requested that Hitler either grant him autonomy in his command or relieve him of his duties. Hitler chose to relieve him, and Küchler took over as commander of Army Group North. Leeb was never given another command. He was tried in the High Command trial, and despite the serious nature of the allegations against him, the outcome was surprisingly lenient. His defense attorney portrayed him as a humane soldier who had not seen or transmitted criminal orders, arguing that the actions of his troops were a result of battle conditions and military necessity. The court convicted Leeb of transmitting the Barbarossa Decree and its criminal application by subordinate units, but he received only a 3-year imprisonment sentence, effectively time served. The judgment stated that no criminal order had been introduced into evidence bearing his signature or stamp of approval, a conclusion that struck many observers as inadequately accounting for the reality of command responsibility in a modern army. It is worth noting that despite his light sentence, Lieb had received substantial financial benefits from the Nazi regime, including secret gifts of 250,000 Reichsmarks and an estate valued at 660,000 Reichsmarks, indicating a level of complicity and reward for his loyalty that his defense as a reluctant professional soldier somewhat obscured. After his release, he went back to his estate in Hohenschwangau, Bavaria, and passed away following a heart attack in 1956. Now let us turn to the man who many historians consider the most purely professional of all the senior German commanders, Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff from 1938 to 1942. Halder was, in many ways, the intellectual backbone of German army planning during the first 3 years of the war. He was meticulous, analytical, and deeply committed to the traditional German concept of staff work as a science rather than an art. His famous war diary, which he kept in a private shorthand throughout the war, has become one of the most important primary sources for understanding how German military planning actually worked, and it reveals with devastating clarity the growing chasm between professional military assessment and Hitler's operational directives. Halder had actually been peripherally involved in the early planning for a coup against Hitler in 1938, during the Czechoslovakia crisis, when several senior officers believed that Hitler's reckless demands might provoke a general European war, that Germany was not ready to fight. The Munich Agreement, which gave Hitler everything he had demanded without a war, ended those discussions. Halder went on to direct the planning for the campaigns in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, producing operational plans of considerable sophistication that were then frequently distorted by Hitler's interference in execution. His diary entry for August 11, 1941, the period of the great strategic debate over Moscow versus the South, is remarkable in its controlled professional anguish. He documented Hitler's decision to divert forces from the central thrust and noted the professional military consensus that this was a catastrophic error. He could record it, he could not stop it. What would Halder have done differently in the summer of 1941 if given genuine operational freedom? The answer is fairly clear from his own writings and from the consistent position of the German General Staff. He would have concentrated German forces on a single decisive axis toward Moscow, maintaining operational momentum through the summer and early autumn before the rains and winter made the roads impassable. Whether this would have been sufficient to capture Moscow, and whether Moscow's fall would have ended Soviet resistance, are the genuinely uncertain questions. There is a school of historical thought, associated particularly with British military historian John Ericsson, which argues that Soviet resistance would have continued regardless of what happened to Moscow, because the Soviet Union's industrial base had already been largely relocated east of the Urals, and because Stalin's totalitarian system could continue to function from alternative capitals. But there is an equally compelling school of thought that argues the psychological and logistical impact of Moscow's fall would have been decisive, particularly in 1941, when the Soviet system was still absorbing the initial shock of the German invasion, and when several Soviet commanders were showing signs of wavering loyalty that might have crystallized into defection or surrender under the additional pressure of Moscow's loss. Halder's relationship with Hitler deteriorated throughout 1941 and 1942, as the General Staff's consistent predictions of Soviet resilience proved accurate and Hitler's consistent predictions of Soviet collapse proved wrong. Hitler, unable to accept that his operational instincts had been faulty, increasingly blamed the generals for the failures of campaigns he had personally directed. By September 1942, with the Stalingrad campaign developing into exactly the kind of overextended disaster that the General Staff had warned about, Halder's dismissal came. He was arrested after the July 20th plot in 1944 and imprisoned in Dachau concentration camp for the remainder of the war, surviving to give testimony at the Nuremberg trials and to live until 1972. He spent his post-war years working extensively with American historians on assessments of the German army's performance, and his analysis was consistently that the professional military judgment of the German General Staff had been sound, and that Hitler's overruling of that judgment had been the primary cause of German defeat. The story of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, is in some ways the most famous individual story of the Second World War, and it provides some of the most compelling evidence for what might have been achieved with consistent operational freedom. Rommel commanded the Afrika Korps in North Africa from 1941 to 1943, and his campaigns there display, in compressed and relatively isolated form, both the extraordinary capabilities of the German professional military and the fatal constraints that Hitler's strategic decisions imposed upon them. Rommel was a battlefield commander of remarkable gifts. He possessed an almost instinctive understanding of terrain and enemy psychology, an ability to process rapidly changing information and make bold decisions faster than opponents could respond, and a personal courage and presence at the front that inspired his troops to extraordinary efforts. German soldiers serving under Rommel consistently gave accounts of feeling that they were commanded by someone who genuinely understood their situation, and who would not throw their lives away needlessly. His North African campaign began in February 1941 when a small German force arrived in Libya to prevent the complete collapse of Italy's position in North Africa. Within weeks, Rommel had gone from defensive stabilisation to offensive operations that pushed the British back across most of Cyrenaica, a performance so rapid and surprising that it shocked the British command and earned him his famous nickname. The campaigns that followed were a remarkable back and forth across the North African desert, with Rommel repeatedly demonstrating an ability to identify and exploit British weaknesses that belied the growing disproportion in resources available to the two sides. By mid-1942, he had driven to within 60 miles of Alexandria and seemed on the verge of breaking through into Egypt, potentially threatening the Suez Canal and Britain's entire position in the Middle East. But here is where the question of what the generals could have achieved without Hitler's interference becomes most pointed in the African theatre. Rommel consistently argued throughout his North African command that the Afrika Korps was being strategically starved. He needed more tanks, more fuel, more ammunition, more infantry. The resources being committed to North Africa were never sufficient to convert tactical successes into strategic decision. Hitler, meanwhile, was pouring resources into the Eastern Front and into the siege of Malta, which he then cancelled, and into other operations that made strategic sense only within his own idiosyncratic framework. Rommel wrote and telegraphed to Berlin repeatedly, arguing that North Africa represented an opportunity to strike a decisive blow against British power in the Middle East that could potentially alter the entire course of the war, but he never received the reinforcements he believed necessary to exploit his victories before the British could recover. What might have happened if Rommel had been given what he asked for? A successful German breakthrough into Egypt in the summer of 1942, supported by adequate armoured and logistical resources, would have placed German forces in control of the Suez Canal, and potentially the entire Middle Eastern oil supply. The British Empire's communications between Europe and Asia would have been severed. The oil fields of Iraq and Persia would have been within reach. German forces linking up with Japanese forces in the Indian Ocean was not an entirely fanciful proposition. The strategic implications of this scenario for the entire course of the war are genuinely difficult to calculate because they would have been so far-reaching. Instead, Rommel ran out of fuel, ran out of tanks, and was eventually driven back by Montgomery's better-supplied 8th Army at El Alamein in October and November 1942. The resources that might have won North Africa were being consumed in the Stalingrad disaster. Rommel's later command in France, where he disagreed with Rundstedt about the proper response to the Allied invasion, has already been touched upon. But there is one more aspect of his story that is essential to understanding the full picture of what the German officer corps thought about Hitler's direction of the war. Rommel, like several other senior commanders, was implicated in the July 20th, 1944 assassination plot against Hitler. The extent of his actual involvement and his knowledge of the planned assassination remain subjects of historical debate, but what is not debated is that he was considered by the conspirators to be someone who might cooperate with a post-Hitler regime in negotiating an armistice with the Western Allies. The fact that one of Germany's most celebrated military commanders, a man who had been Hitler's personally favoured general and whose name had been used extensively in Nazi propaganda, had by 1944 concluded that Hitler needed to be removed to save Germany, tells us something profound about how thoroughly Hitler had alienated even his most admired military servants. Rommel was given the choice between a public trial and suicide in October 1944. He chose suicide and was buried with full military honours, the Nazi regime maintaining the fiction of his death from battle wounds for its propaganda purposes. Karl Dönitz occupies a unique position in our story because he represents a different kind of what-if question. Where most of the generals we have considered were in conflict with Hitler over land operations, Dönitz commanded Germany's submarine fleet and prosecuted what was arguably the most strategically important campaign that Germany fought in the entire war. The Battle of the Atlantic was Germany's one genuine opportunity to starve Britain into submission, or at least into strategic paralysis, before American entry into the war had fully turned the tide. Between 1940 and 1943, German U-boats sank millions of tons of Allied shipping, and for a period in 1942, the losses were so severe that there were genuine Allied fears that the maritime supply line to Britain might not be maintainable. Dönitz had been arguing since before the war began that submarine warfare offered Germany its best strategic lever against Britain. He had written analyses demonstrating that with 300 operational U-boats, he could sink sufficient Allied tonnage to strangle British trade. He never got 300 boats. The German naval building program prioritized surface ships, particularly the great battleships and cruisers that Hitler personally found more glamorous than submarines. When war broke out in September 1939, Dönitz had only 57 U-boats available, and only 22 of them were suitable for Atlantic operations. The result was that the potentially decisive submarine campaign was fought throughout 1940 and 1941, with forces that were adequate to cause serious damage, but never quite sufficient to deliver the knockout blow that Dönitz believed possible with the forces he had requested. The what-if here is clear and important. If Dönitz had been given his 300 boats from the beginning of the war, if the German naval construction program had been oriented towards submarine production rather than surface ship prestige projects, would the Atlantic battle have been won before Allied anti-submarine technology, the introduction of radar, long-range aircraft, and the breaking of the Enigma codes could turn the tide? The honest answer is that we cannot know with certainty, but many naval historians believe that a sustained U-boat campaign with the forces Dönitz requested might well have produced losses that Britain could not sustain indefinitely. After the war, Dönitz succeeded Hitler as head of state in the Goebbels cabinet, directed the signing of Germany's surrender, and was tried at Nuremberg. He faced charges of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. While acquitted of crimes against humanity, he was found guilty of the other charges and served a 10-year sentence in Berlin's Spandau prison. After his release in 1956, he relocated to a small town near Hamburg and in 1958 published his autobiography, passionately claiming he had had no knowledge of Hitler's crimes against the Jews. He passed away in 1980 after a prolonged illness. Albert Kesselring represents yet another dimension of this question, because his post-1943 career as the defender of Italy demonstrates with extraordinary clarity what a skilled German commander could achieve on the defensive with limited resources when given consistent operational freedom. Kesselring, nicknamed Smiling Albert for his pleasant demeanour, had one of the most diverse military careers of the war. He had started in the artillery, transferred to the Luftwaffe in 1935, led air fleets in Poland and France, played a crucial part in the Battle of Britain, and then served as Commander-in-Chief South during the Mediterranean campaigns. His defensive campaign in Italy from 1943 to 1945 is considered by military historians to be one of the masterpieces of defensive operational art in modern military history. The Allied landings in Sicily in July 1943 and then the invasion of the Italian mainland in September were supposed to knock Italy out of the war quickly and then drive rapidly north to put pressure on Germany from the south. What actually happened was that Kesselring's skillful use of Italy's mountainous terrain, his exploitation of every defensive advantage the landscape offered, and his ability to conduct delaying actions and tactical withdrawals at precisely the right moments allowed a relatively small German force to hold a much larger Allied army at bay for nearly 2 years. The Gothic Line, the Winter Line, the Gustav Line, the battles for Monte Cassino that dragged on for months despite enormous Allied firepower advantages, all of these represent Kesselring's professional ability to extract maximum defensive value from minimum resources. What this tells us about the broader what-if question is significant. A German military machine directed by professional competence rather than political interference would not necessarily have won the war, but it would almost certainly have prolonged it significantly on the defensive, and it might have achieved negotiated terms that the actual trajectory of events never permitted. Kesselring was tried by a British military court in Venice in 1947 for ordering the execution of 335 Italian civilian hostages in the Ardeatine Cave massacre in March 1944, carried out as retaliation for an Italian partisan attack on German soldiers. He was convicted and initially sentenced to death on May 6, 1947, but his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and he was pardoned and released in 1952 because of his declining health. He became involved in various veterans associations after his release and passed away in 1960. Wilhelm Keitel, as chief of Hitler's personal military staff throughout the war, represents perhaps the most damning case against the proposition that the generals could have run the war better, because Keitel is in many ways the model of what happened when a senior military officer chose complete subservience to Hitler over professional integrity. Keitel had developed a strong admiration for Hitler during his rise to power and had become the head of the restructured German High Command in 1938, a position he held until the end of the war. His fellow officers gave him a nickname that captured their contempt for his sycophancy. They called him Lacketel, a pun on the German word Lakai, meaning lackey. He was seen by serious professional soldiers as someone who had traded military professionalism for personal proximity to power. Keitel's military career before World War II had involved mostly staff officer and administrative roles, and he had gained promotion to Major General in 1933. His involvement in devising a consolidated command structure had caught Hitler's attention, and his appointment as its leader in 1938 owed more to his political reliability than to his military brilliance. Following his promotion, he played a significant role in bringing Austria and Czechoslovakia under Nazi control, participated in planning the 1939 attack on Poland, and outlined the terms of surrender to the French government. After Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal in 1940, Keitel quickly began planning the invasion of the Soviet Union. What makes Keitel's case particularly important for our purposes is that he represents the path not taken by most of the commanders we have been discussing, where Brauchitsch, Manstein, Guderian, Halder, and Rundstedt all at various points either pushed back against Hitler's decisions, requested to be relieved rather than carry out orders they believed to be militarily or morally wrong, or at least recorded their professional disagreements in writing. Keitel simply obeyed. His role was to transmit Hitler's decisions to the army and to provide them with whatever institutional legitimacy his signature and rank could lend. The orders he issued during the Russian offensive, which the Nuremberg prosecution characterized as war crimes against civilians, were transmitted by Keitel without recorded professional objection. He was captured by the British in May 1945, indicted for war crimes by the International Military Tribunal in August of the same year, and tried alongside other top Nazi officials. Unlike most defendants, he accepted responsibility for his actions, acknowledging that he was responsible for all outcomes resulting from his signed orders. In October 1946, he was found guilty of the charges and sentenced to death. Despite his request for execution by a military firing squad, which he clearly felt was his right as a soldier, Keitel was hanged on October 16, 1946, in Nuremberg. His final words were, "I salute you, my eternal Germany," a declaration of loyalty to a Germany that no longer existed and perhaps had never quite existed in the form he imagined. The contrast between Keitel and men like Manstein or Guderian is instructive. Keitel's utter subservience to Hitler produced not better outcomes for Germany, but worse ones, because it removed from the decision-making process the one check that might have occasionally tempered Hitler's most disastrous impulses. When Manstein argued with Hitler at the Situation Conferences, when Guderian flew to Hitler's headquarters to protest the August 1941 diversion, when Rundstedt told Keitel to make peace, these men were at least inserting professional military judgment into the process, even if that judgment was ultimately overruled. Keitel's role was to make sure that Hitler's decisions were implemented without friction, and the result was a command system in which the most reckless strategic choices could proceed without encountering any institutional resistance. Alfred Jodl, holding the rank of General Oberst and serving as chief of the operations staff within the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the high command of the German armed forces throughout the duration of the war, occupies another fascinating position in our story. Jodl was intellectually formidable, personally loyal to Hitler in a way that distinguished him from most of the army commanders we have been discussing, and capable of both professional military analysis and political accommodation simultaneously. He was not simply a Keitel-style yes man. He had genuine strategic insights and expressed them at various points in the war. But he was also willing to transmit and justify orders that his professional judgment must have recognized as militarily or morally indefensible. Jodl served at Hitler's side throughout the war, attending the twice-daily military situation conferences at the Führer's headquarters, where the operational decisions of the entire German war effort were made. He was therefore in a unique position to observe, at first hand and continuously, the process by which Hitler's intuitions and obsessions translated into military orders. His diary entries and his testimony at Nuremberg provide one of the most complete records we have of how that process worked, and they paint a picture of a man who was intelligent enough to understand the military consequences of Hitler's decisions, but who lacked or chose not to exercise the willingness to resist them that would have marked a fully independent professional. The primary accusations tied to Jodl's name at Nuremberg were his endorsement of the Commando Order and the Commissar Order. The Commissar Order mandated the immediate execution of Soviet political officers upon capture. The Commando Order mandated the summary execution of Allied Special Operations Forces regardless of whether they were in uniform. Both of these orders were clear violations of the laws of war, and both were transmitted through Jodl's operations staff. He justified the 1941 mass shootings of Soviet prisoners of war by asserting during his trial that only those prisoners who chose not to walk were executed, not those physically unable to do so, a distinction that struck his prosecutors as essentially meaningless given the scale and systematization of the killings. He faced numerous accusations during his trial, including illegal deportation and facilitating executions, buttressed by his documented order to relocate Danish citizens, including Jewish individuals, to Nazi-operated concentration camps. He successfully refuted several accusations, such as his alleged aid to Hitler in seizing control of Germany in 1933. Jodl pleaded not guilty, but was eventually found guilty on all 4 counts, and hanged in Nuremberg prison on October 16, 1946. His final utterance was, "Ich grüße dich, mein ewiges Deutschland," translating to, "I salute you, my eternal Germany." Jodl's case raises a question that sits at the very heart of our larger inquiry. Could a man with his intelligence and his position have done more to redirect German strategy in a more professionally sound direction? He was physically present at every major operational decision of the war. He had Hitler's ear in a way that most of the army commanders we have discussed did not. And yet his influence on strategy appears to have been consistently toward enabling Hitler's decisions rather than questioning them. The professional military capacity was there. The institutional position was there. What was apparently lacking was the willingness to stake his career and his life on professional principle in the way that Halder or Manstein or even Rundstedt occasionally did. Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist commands our attention next, not only because of his extraordinary battlefield record, but because his post-war fate, dying in Soviet captivity at Vladimir Central Prison, stands as one of the most poignant endings of any senior German commander. Kleist came from a family with a long history of military service, and his career spanned both world wars with distinction. He was particularly recognized for his leadership during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. He commanded the 1st Panzer Group during the invasion of France in 1940, leading a fast-moving armoured thrust that penetrated deep into French defences, contributing to the swift German victory that shocked the world. In 1941, Kleist was involved in Operation Barbarossa, commanding the 1st Panzer Army and leading some of the largest tank battles in history, including the encirclement of Soviet forces at Uman and Kiev. These operations inflicted massive losses on the Red Army and contributed to the initial German advance into Soviet territory. What Kleist thought of the Soviet military evolved dramatically over the course of the war, as it did for most German commanders. He later stated, reflecting on this shift in perception, "From the very beginning, the Russians proved themselves first-class warriors. Our successes in the first months of the war can be explained by better training. Having gained combat experience, the Russians became first-class soldiers, and they fought with exceptional perseverance and had astounding endurance." This is the judgment of a professional military man who had fought the Red Army extensively and who had reached conclusions based on evidence rather than ideology. It stands in sharp contrast to the systematic underestimation of Soviet military capacity that pervaded German strategic planning from the very beginning of Barbarossa. Kleist's career took a significant turn in 1942 when he was appointed commander of Army Group A during the German offensive into the Caucasus. His forces were tasked with capturing the vital oil fields of the region, but the campaign faltered due to the overextension of German resources and fierce Soviet resistance. By early 1943, the Germans were forced to retreat from the Caucasus, marking one of the clearest turning points in the war. On March 30th, 1944, after a series of retreats and failures in the increasingly desperate defensive battles on the Eastern Front, Kleist was dismissed by Hitler, who was by that point dismissing commanders at such a rate that it had become almost meaningless as a form of professional accountability. He was succeeded by Ferdinand Schörner, whose brutal enforcement methods represented Hitler's ultimate answer to the problem of commanders who told him unwelcome military truths. Following the July 20th assassination attempt, the Gestapo implicated Kleist due to his cousin's involvement in the Oster conspiracy. Despite the arrest, he managed to avoid trial and was subsequently released. After the war, Kleist was captured by Allied forces and handed over to Yugoslavia, where he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for war crimes. He was later extradited to the Soviet Union, where he faced trial for war crimes related to his commands on the Eastern Front. He was sentenced to 25 years in a correctional labor camp. Kleist's final years were spent in Soviet captivity. On November 13, 1954, he died of heart failure while imprisoned at Vladimir Central Prison. His death made him one of the highest-ranking German officers to die in Soviet custody, and it represented the end of a military career that had encompassed some of the most spectacular armoured operations in military history, alongside actions that would be judged as criminal by any reasonable standard of international law. Let us pause here and consider what the accumulated evidence of all these careers tells us about the central question we are exploring. The German generals we have examined were, by any measure, extraordinarily capable professional military men. They had defeated France in 6 weeks. They had conquered most of Western Europe and driven deep into the Soviet Union. They had fought prolonged defensive campaigns against overwhelming Allied material superiority with a skill that prolonged the war far beyond what the raw balance of forces would have suggested was possible. And they had done all of this while operating under the constant constraint of Hitler's interference, his refusal to authorize withdrawals, his insistence on personally directing operations across a front of thousands of kilometers from his bunker headquarters, his dismissal of commanders who told him uncomfortable truths, and his substitution of ideological obsession for military calculation. The question is not whether these men were moral exemplars. Many of them were not. The war crimes committed by German forces on the Eastern Front, in the Balkans, and wherever SS and Wehrmacht units operated together were real and documented. Some of the commanders we have discussed transmitted criminal orders, participated in atrocities, or remained silent when professional courage would have demanded they speak. The moral ledger of the German officer corps is deeply troubling, and the post-war trials, for all their imperfections and inconsistencies, were justified attempts to establish the principle that professional military service does not exempt a person from responsibility for crimes committed in the course of that service. But the question of moral character is distinct from the question of professional military capability, and the professional military assessment of these men is remarkably consistent across their careers and across the judgments of military historians on both sides of the conflict. They were extraordinarily good at their jobs, and their jobs, conducted without Hitler's interference, might have produced a very different war. The German concept of Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, deserves particular attention here because it represents the philosophical foundation of everything the German professional military did well. The concept, developed over nearly 2 centuries of Prussian and German military reform, held that commanders at every level should be given clear objectives and then trusted to find the best way to achieve those objectives using their own judgment and initiative. Orders should specify what needed to be accomplished, not how to accomplish it. This was explicitly contrasted with the French and British systems, which tended toward more prescriptive orders that left less initiative to subordinate commanders. General Gunther Blumentritt, a key planner of the invasions of France and Poland, described George Patton as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies and noted that his operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander. This tells us something important. The Germans recognized and respected the Auftragstaktik approach wherever they encountered it, because it matched their own professional philosophy. Now imagine this system operating in reverse. Imagine the German military being directed by commanders who had themselves been trained in Auftragstaktik, who trusted their subordinates to execute broad strategic directives using their own professional judgment, rather than being directed by a man who issued enormously detailed operational orders from a headquarters hundreds of kilometers from the front, and who fired commanders when they adapted those orders to battlefield realities that differed from his assumptions. The contrast between how the German army was designed to function and how it actually had to function under Hitler's direction is almost painful to contemplate. The system that had been built over generations to produce flexible, adaptive, initiative-taking commanders at every level was being directed by a man whose fundamental philosophy was the opposite: centralized control, rigid adherence to orders, punishment of independent judgment. The case of Fedor von Bock illuminates this contradiction with particular clarity. Bock was one of the most professionally exacting commanders in the German army, a man whose personal manner was so cold and demanding that his troops nicknamed him Der Sterber, meaning roughly the one who bleeds you dry, yet who consistently demonstrated the operational professionalism that the situation demanded. He had commanded Army Group North during the French campaign, Army Group Centre during the opening of Barbarossa, and it was in this last role that his story intersects most directly with the Moscow question. In the autumn of 1941, Army Group Centre under Bock was executing Operation Typhoon, the drive toward Moscow. The operation had begun, promisingly in October, with two massive encirclements at Bryansk and Vyazma that captured over 650,000 Soviet soldiers and seemed to clear the road to Moscow. But the autumn rains then turned the roads to impassable mud, halting the German advance for crucial weeks. When the ground froze in November and the advance resumed, German troops were fighting without adequate winter clothing, in temperatures far below zero, against a Soviet defense that was stiffening by the day. Bock pressed the attack far beyond what his professional judgment told him was sustainable, partly because he genuinely believed Moscow might fall, and partly because he understood that halting the operation would result in his dismissal. His divisions reached points where they could see Moscow's suburbs through their binoculars. Then the Soviet counteroffensive struck, and Army Group Centre was pushed back in a crisis that nearly became a collapse. Bock's professional dilemma in November and December 1941 represents something that goes to the heart of our central question. A commander who is threatened with dismissal for exercising professional judgment about the limits of his force's endurance will be tempted to override that professional judgment and press attacks that his training tells him are unlikely to succeed. Hitler's practice of dismissing commanders who told him unwelcome truths did not produce commanders who were willing to be honest with him. It produced commanders who told him what he wanted to hear or who pressed attacks they privately believed were futile in order to keep their jobs. The result was that the command system was systematically deprived of accurate information from the front at precisely the moments when accurate information was most critical. Bock was eventually dismissed in January 1942, citing health reasons, recalled to command Army Group South during the summer 1942 offensive, disagreed with Hitler over the operational plan for Case Blue, and was dismissed again in July 1942. He died on May 4, 1945, just days before the German surrender, killed in a British air attack on a motor convoy. His death in the last days of the war was in many ways emblematic of the fate of the entire German officer corps that he represented. Professionals caught in the wreckage of a war that their professional judgment had told them was going wrong, and that their political situation had prevented them from redirecting. Maximilian von Weichs is another figure whose story rewards careful examination. Weichs had commanded the Second Army during major military campaigns, including the invasions of France, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. His role in these operations brought him to the forefront of Nazi Germany's war efforts. In 1944, he was appointed commander of the German forces in the Balkans, where his responsibilities included suppressing partisan resistance movements in Yugoslavia and Greece. His tenure in the Balkans was characterized by brutal anti-partisan operations and widespread atrocities against civilians, a reflection of the increasingly desperate measures the German military employed in the later stages of the war. Weichs retired from his military career on March 25, 1945, and was arrested by American troops in May. The Nuremberg trials included Weichs among those to be prosecuted. Specifically, he was scheduled to participate in the United States Army's hostages trial, facing charges related to the suppression of partisans in the Balkans. In a surprising turn of events, Weichs was removed from the proceedings before being judged or sentenced. The official reason given was medical reasons, a justification that raised ethical questions about accountability for war crimes. This decision allowed Weichs to evade prosecution despite his alleged involvement in serious wartime atrocities. Maximilian von Weichs died on September 27, 1954, in Bonn, West Germany, at the age of 72. The Balkans theatre that Weichs commanded in 1944 raises its own version of the what-if question. The German occupation of Yugoslavia and Greece had from the beginning been characterized by a brutality that was, paradoxically, militarily counterproductive. The mass reprisals against civilian populations, the execution of hostages, the collective punishment of villages suspected of sheltering partisans, all of these policies were intended to suppress resistance but consistently had the opposite effect. They drove neutral, or potentially neutral, populations into the partisan camps, expanded the resistance rather than suppressing it, and tied down increasingly large numbers of German troops in anti-partisan operations that produced no positive military outcome. Professional military advice, both within the German system and from outside observers, consistently pointed out that less brutal occupation policies would have been more effective militarily, quite apart from their moral superiority. The refusal to adopt such policies was driven by ideological commitments that trumped military effectiveness, and the result was a partisan war in Yugoslavia that consumed German resources for 4 years without ever approaching resolution. Now we must address a figure whose career spans the entire range of the German military experience in this war, from the brilliant professional triumphs of 1939 and 1940 to the catastrophic final collapses of 1944 and 1945. Ferdinand Schörner is in many ways the dark mirror image of the generals we have been celebrating for their professional integrity. Where Manstein was respected by his opponents as a military genius, Schörner was feared by his own troops as a man who enforced discipline through terror. Where Guderian argued with Hitler on professional grounds, Schörner provided Hitler with exactly the kind of fanatical political reliability that the Führer prized above professional judgment. He became one of Hitler's most trusted and most feared commanders in the final phase of the war, precisely because he was willing to do things that commanders with more professional self-respect refused to do. Schörner had served with distinction in World War I and the interwar period, but his defining characteristic as a commander was his willingness to use extreme violence against his own troops to maintain discipline. He was personally responsible for the execution of numerous German soldiers for offences ranging from desertion to defeatism, to simply being found away from their units during the chaos of the final months of the war. He drove through his area of command in a staff car, personally checking that every soldier was at his post, and had men shot on the spot if he found them absent, without acceptable explanation. His troops, not unreasonably, feared him more than they feared the enemy. His leadership style was the antithesis of the Auftragstaktik philosophy. Where that philosophy trusted commanders and soldiers to exercise intelligent judgment, Schörner replaced judgment with fear. What is instructive about Schörner's career for our purposes is that it represents Hitler's answer to the problem of commanders who exercised independent professional judgment. The answer, in the final phase of the war, was to promote men who would not exercise independent judgment, who would hold their positions until physically overwhelmed, because terror of their own commander exceeded their terror of the enemy. This approach produced exactly the military results one would expect. Schörner's army groups fought to the bitter end, suffering enormous casualties, achieving nothing strategically, and prolonging the suffering of both his own troops and the populations his forces occupied. He was captured by American forces, handed over to the Soviets, tried for war crimes, and sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. He was released in 1954 and returned to West Germany, where he was subsequently prosecuted again for orders he had given that resulted in the execution of German soldiers. He died in 1973, one of the most reviled figures in the post-war German military memory. The contrast between Schörner and men like Manstein or Guderian tells us something essential about the difference between military professionalism and political reliability as qualities in military command. Hitler ultimately chose political reliability over professional quality in his senior commanders, and the military results were precisely what his better professional advisors had always warned would follow. By 1944 and 1945, the German army was being commanded at the senior level by a combination of exhausted professionals operating under impossible constraints and ideological loyalists whose main qualification was their willingness to follow any order regardless of its military rationality. The predictable result was a series of catastrophic defensive collapses that even Hitler's own fanatical willpower could not prevent. Heinz Guderian's return to prominence as Chief of the Army General Staff in July 1944, following the dismissal of Kurt Zeitzler in the aftermath of the Bagration disaster, represents the last moment at which genuinely professional military advice was being regularly inserted into the highest levels of German strategic decision-making. Guderian's appointment came in circumstances of extreme crisis. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, had shattered Army Group Center in a disaster that dwarfed Stalingrad in scale. 28 of 34 divisions in Army Group Center had been effectively destroyed. The Eastern Front had been torn open across a width of hundreds of kilometers. The Red Army was driving toward Warsaw and East Prussia. Guderian's situation was essentially impossible. He was trying to insert professional military judgment into a decision-making process that had been designed to exclude it in circumstances where the military situation was so desperate that no amount of professional skill could reverse the fundamental balance of forces. His twice-daily confrontations with Hitler at the Situation Conferences have been described by witnesses as extraordinary scenes, with Guderian presenting accurate assessments of the military situation and Hitler alternating between denial, rage, and wishful thinking. Guderian later wrote in his memoirs that he had banged his head against a wall in trying to persuade Hitler to adopt rational military policies, and the metaphor captures perfectly the futility of his position. The specific cases of Guderian's professional recommendations in this final period tell us something important. He consistently argued for strategic withdrawals that would shorten the front and free reserves for counterattacks at critical points. He argued against Hitler's insisted fortress policy, which designated cities as fortresses to be held to the last man, regardless of military consequence, a policy that resulted in the encirclement and destruction of numerous German garrisons that could have been saved for continued resistance if allowed to withdraw. He argued for transferring forces from secondary theatres to the main front. He argued with increasing desperation as the Soviet offensives approached Germany's eastern borders in January 1945. That the situation was militarily catastrophic and that immediate action was necessary to prevent the fall of Berlin. Hitler overruled him consistently on every major point. Guderian was finally dismissed in March 1945 and spent the last weeks of the war in a Bavarian sanatorium, awaiting the end. The Stalingrad disaster of 1942 to 1943 deserves extended consideration because it represents the single most avoidable strategic catastrophe in German military history, a catastrophe that a professional military command would almost certainly have prevented. The chain of decisions that led to the encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army reads like a case study in the consequences of political interference in military operations. The fundamental problem began with the planning for Case Blue, the German summer offensive of 1942. The offensive was given two simultaneous objectives: the capture of Stalingrad on the Volga River and the capture of the Caucasus oil fields. German professional military planners, including Halder, recognized that the German army did not have sufficient forces to prosecute both objectives simultaneously with the strength that each required. They argued for concentrating on one objective, either the Stalingrad axis or the Caucasus axis, completing it and then redirecting forces toward the second objective. Hitler refused this advice and ordered both operations to proceed simultaneously, which meant that neither would receive the forces needed for decisive success. As German forces approached Stalingrad in the late summer of 1942 and became embroiled in the intense urban fighting for the city, the Sixth Army commander Friedrich Paulus requested permission to adjust his positions and conserve his forces. Professional military judgment clearly indicated that Stalingrad itself was of limited strategic value compared to the oil fields in the Caucasus, and that the commitment of German forces in street fighting for a city named after Stalin was driven more by Hitler's personal obsession than by military logic. The professional recommendation was to break off the Stalingrad battle and use the Sixth Army's strength more productively. Elsewhere, Hitler refused. When the Soviet counteroffensive struck in November 1942, cutting off the Sixth Army in its exposed salient, Manstein argued for a breakout. Paulus himself requested permission to break out before the encirclement solidified. Hitler refused both, ordering the Sixth Army to hold in place and promising supply by air, a promise that Goering's Luftwaffe proved catastrophically unable to fulfill. The airlift required to sustain the Sixth Army would have needed roughly 750 tons of supplies per day. The maximum the Luftwaffe ever delivered was 530 tons in a single day, and the average was far lower, often under 100 tons. The Sixth Army starved, froze, and was ground down by the Soviet forces closing around it. Manstein's relief operation, Operation Winterstorm, drove to within 50 kilometers of the Sixth Army's perimeter in December 1942 before stalling due to insufficient forces. If Hitler had authorized the Sixth Army to break out and fight toward the relief force at this moment, there was at least a possibility of saving the bulk of the encircled troops. Professional military analysis suggests that a substantial portion of the Sixth Army could have escaped. Instead, the Sixth Army was ordered to hold its position, and by the time Hitler accepted that it was hopeless in February 1943, over 90,000 survivors were surrendering to Soviet forces. Most of them would die in Soviet captivity. The Stalingrad catastrophe had consequences that went far beyond the immediate military losses. It was the first major German defeat that was publicly acknowledged within Germany, and it shattered the myth of German invincibility that had been carefully constructed and maintained since 1939. The psychological impact on the German population was enormous. More concretely, the loss of the Sixth Army removed from the Eastern Front a force that could not be replaced with equivalent quality. The experienced officers, NCOs and soldiers who died or were captured at Stalingrad had been trained under the pre-war professional system and had accumulated irreplaceable battlefield experience. Their replacements were necessarily of lower quality, trained more quickly, and with less of the professional foundation that had made the early Wehrmacht so formidable. The contrast with how a professionally directed German military would have handled the same situation is instructive. A professional command would have recognized by October 1942, at the latest, that the Stalingrad battle had become a strategic trap. It would have withdrawn the Sixth Army from its exposed position, established a defensible front line along the Don River, and used the saved forces to build operational reserves for the spring campaign. The result might not have been a German victory in the East, given the fundamental imbalance of resources that was developing by that point, but it would have avoided one of the most catastrophic single defeats of the war and preserved fighting forces that might have significantly extended Germany's capacity for resistance. The question of what extended German resistance would have meant for the overall outcome of the war is itself a profound and troubling one. We must be careful not to romanticize the general's professional competence in a way that separates it from the causes they were serving. A Germany that fought more effectively under professional military direction would have extended the war. Extended war meant extended occupation of conquered territories. Extended occupation meant extended implementation of the Holocaust and the other Nazi policies of mass murder that were being carried out as the Wehrmacht fought. A professionally superior German military was not a morally superior German military. The crimes of the Third Reich were not side effects of Hitler's military incompetence. They were the purpose of the war as Hitler conceived it. This is the central moral paradox of the question we are examining. The same professional military competence that might have produced better operational outcomes for Germany was the instrument through which those operational outcomes served the purposes of one of history's most monstrous regimes. When we admire Manstein's operational art or Guderian's armoured doctrine, we must simultaneously remember that the battles they were fighting were intended to conquer territory in which millions of people were being murdered, enslaved, and starved. The supply lines that Guderian's panzer armies needed to maintain their mobility were sharing road and rail capacity with the transports that were carrying Jews to the death camps in the east. Several of the generals we have discussed were aware of these realities to varying degrees. Manstein, in his post-war memoirs and testimony, maintained that he had not known about the Holocaust and had not participated in or condoned the criminal operations of the SS. Historians have disputed this claim extensively, pointing to orders that passed through his headquarters and to testimony from subordinate officers that suggests awareness was more widespread than the generals admitted. The truth is probably complex and varies from individual to individual, but the institutional reality is clear. The Wehrmacht and the SS were operating in the same theatre, sharing the same administrative infrastructure, and the crimes of the SS were not invisible to the army that was operating alongside them. The July 20th, 1944 conspiracy to assassinate Hitler provides us with the clearest direct evidence of what at least some German officers thought should have been done about the situation. The conspirators, who included former Chief of Staff Ludwig Beck, former ambassador and Reich Commissioner in Oslo Josef Terboven, former State Secretary in the Foreign Office Ernst von Weizsäcker, Klaus von Stauffenberg, who planted the bomb, Henning von Treschow, who had been central to resistance planning from the Eastern Front, and many others, represented a cross-section of German conservative and military opposition to the Nazi regime. Their plan was not simply to kill Hitler, but to replace the Nazi regime with a conservative government that would then negotiate a peace with the Western Allies before the Soviet Union could overrun Germany. The conspiracy failed, as we know, because the bomb placed by Stauffenberg at the Wolf's Lair headquarters on July 20th, 1944, did not kill Hitler. It killed 4 other people and wounded numerous others, but left Hitler shaken and temporarily deafened rather than dead. The subsequent repression was swift and devastating. More than 7,000 people were arrested in the aftermath, and close to 5,000 were executed, including most of the conspirators and many who had been only peripherally connected to the plot. The executions were carried out with deliberate brutality in some cases, with Stauffenberg and several immediate co-conspirators shot in the courtyard of the Bendler Block in Berlin on the night of July 20th. And with others tried before the People's Court under the judge Roland Freisler, who subjected them to humiliation and abuse before sentencing them to death by hanging from meat hooks, a death deliberately chosen to be as undignified as possible. The July 20th conspiracy is relevant to our central question in a specific and important way. It tells us that by 1944, a significant number of German officers had concluded that Hitler's direction of the war was so catastrophic that his removal was necessary to save Germany from complete destruction. These were not men who had opposed the war or who had moral objections to the conquest of Poland or France. Most of them had served loyally through the years of German victories. What drove them to resistance was the accumulating evidence that Hitler's military judgment was leading Germany to annihilation, combined in many cases with a growing recognition that the crimes being committed in Germany's name were morally intolerable. The two motivations, professional military despair and moral revulsion, were intertwined in ways that it is difficult to fully separate. What the conspiracy's failure tells us is equally important. If we are asking what would have happened if the generals had been running the war, part of the answer is that by 1944, the generals who had the clearest perception of what was needed had tried to take over the war and had been caught and killed. The generals who survived and continued fighting were predominantly either the ideological loyalists who had no intention of challenging Hitler, or the professionals who had resigned themselves to operating within constraints they could not change. The window in which a professional military takeover might have redirected the war toward a less catastrophic outcome had probably closed well before July 1944. Hermann Göring's story adds another dimension to our analysis that is often overlooked because Göring is primarily remembered as a figure of grotesque excess and ultimate failure. But in the early years of the Nazi regime, Göring had been one of the most powerful political figures in Germany, and his control of the Luftwaffe represented an important check on army dominance of German military strategy. The question of what Göring's professional military judgment contributed to German strategy is complicated by the fact that Göring was not primarily a professional military man, but rather a political figure who commanded a military force. his consistent overconfidence in the Luftwaffe's capabilities, which led him to promise Hitler that the trapped forces at Dunkirk could be destroyed from the air, that Leningrad could be supplied by air, that the Sixth Army at Stalingrad could be supplied by air, all of these promises contributing to German strategic disasters, represents the worst kind of military advice, politically convenient but professionally irresponsible. The German officers who were genuinely professional in their approach to aviation warfare, men like Werner Mölders and Adolf Galland, who commanded fighter forces with considerable skill, understood the Luftwaffe's limitations in a way that Göring did not. Galland, in particular, fought a long and ultimately losing battle to redirect German air strategy toward defensive fighter production rather than offensive bomber production in the critical period when the Allied strategic bombing campaign was beginning to impose serious costs on German industry. His famous memo to Göring in 1943 reporting that American P-51 Mustang fighters were appearing over Berlin, and Göring's response that this was impossible because no Allied fighter had the range to reach Berlin, encapsulates the contrast between professional military reality assessment and political wishful thinking that characterized German military command from the highest levels downward. The question of the Italian campaign deserves additional attention because it provides perhaps the best example of what the German military could achieve on the defensive with professional management. When Italy surrendered in September 1943 and German forces had to simultaneously disarm their former ally, prevent the capture of Italian government leaders, and establish a defensive line against an Allied invasion of the mainland, the speed and efficiency with which German forces executed these multiple complex tasks was genuinely impressive. Within days, German forces had taken control of most of Italy, had secured key strategic assets, had interned Italian military units, and had begun constructing the defensive lines that would delay the Allied advance for nearly 2 years. Kesselring's management of the defensive campaign that followed exemplified professional military art. He exploited every terrain feature, conducted controlled withdrawals at exactly the right moments, maintained the cohesion of his forces despite constant Allied pressure, and extracted maximum delay from minimum resources. The battles at Monte Cassino, where Allied forces attacking one of the most formidable natural defensive positions in Europe were held at bay for months despite overwhelming material superiority, represent Kesselring's defensive genius at its most impressive. The Gustav Line and the subsequent Gothic Line were not simply static defensive positions, but active defensive systems in which Kesselring's forces retained the initiative for local counterattacks, even while conducting an overall strategic withdrawal. What if Kesselring-level professional management had been applied to the Eastern Front from the beginning? The question is almost too large to answer because the scale of operations in the East was so much greater and the resources so much more stretched. But the principle is the same. A defense conducted by professionals who understood when to hold and when to withdraw, who conserved their forces by not being ordered to hold hopeless positions to the last man, and who maintained the operational flexibility to strike back at Soviet overextensions, would have been far more effective than the rigid hold-or-die defense that Hitler's interference actually produced. The evidence from Italy suggests that even relatively small German forces, professionally handled, could impose disproportionate costs on an attacker with material superiority. Applied to the Eastern Front on a much larger scale, professional defensive management might have stabilized the front far earlier than it was actually stabilized and at far lower cost to German forces. The case of Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy before Dönitz, illustrates yet another dimension of the professional versus political tension. Raeder was in many respects the model of the traditional German naval officer, steeped in the traditions of the Imperial German Navy and committed to the concept of a balanced fleet, capable of challenging British naval supremacy. His strategic vision for German sea power was sophisticated and long-term, and in normal circumstances it would have been the foundation for building a navy capable of seriously competing with the Royal Navy. The problem was that his vision required time that Germany's situation, driven by Hitler's aggressive timeline for European conquest, could not provide. Raeder had opposed the early start of the war in 1939 precisely because the German Navy was not ready. His famous assessment was that in the event of war with Britain, the German Navy could do no more than demonstrate that it knew how to die with dignity. because it lacked the forces to contest British naval supremacy. He was overruled by Hitler's political timeline, and the German Navy went to war against Britain with a surface fleet that was outnumbered and outclassed by the Royal Navy. The spectacular early successes of German surface raiders like the Bismarck and the Scharnhorst were genuine feats of seamanship and tactical skill, but they could not alter the fundamental strategic imbalance. Raiders' eventual replacement by Dönitz in 1943, driven by Hitler's fury at the failure of German surface ships to stop a British convoy in the Battle of the Barents Sea, represented the final abandonment of the balanced fleet strategy in favour of the submarine campaign that Dönitz had always believed offered Germany's best naval option. What Rader's case tells us about professional military management is that strategic patience, the willingness to build capabilities over time rather than deploying them before they are ready, is a fundamental requirement of professional military judgment that was systematically incompatible with Hitler's impatient and opportunistic approach to strategy. A professionally managed German military preparing for war against Britain would have recognized that naval parity or superiority required a minimum of 5 to 7 years of intensive construction. It would have shaped Germany's diplomatic and political timeline accordingly. Hitler's timeline was shaped by political considerations that had nothing to do with military readiness, and the result was a navy that went to war before it was prepared and paid an enormous price for that unpreparedness. Georg Hans Reinhardt is less well known than many of the commanders we have been discussing, but his career on the Eastern Front provides important supporting evidence for our central thesis. Reinhardt commanded Panzer Group 3 during Operation Barbarossa and later Army Group Center during the desperate defensive battles of 1944 and 1945. He was a professional of the First Order, a tank commander who had trained under the influence of Guderian's armoured doctrine and who understood the mobile offensive capabilities of armoured forces as well as any officer in the German army. His performance during Operation Barbarossa was consistently excellent, and his ability to manage the complex logistics of mobile armoured operations in the enormous spaces of the Soviet Union demonstrated the kind of professional competence that distinguished the best German commanders from their less accomplished peers. By the time Reinhardt was commanding Army Group Center in 1944 and 1945, however, the resources available to him were so reduced and the constraints imposed by Hitler's intervention so severe that professional competence could accomplish very little. He was dismissed in January 1945 after disagreeing with Hitler about the proper defensive strategy for East Prussia. Like so many of his colleagues, he had reached a point where the professional military judgment that his entire career had cultivated was simply incompatible with the orders he was receiving. His dismissal followed the same pattern we have seen repeatedly: a professional commander presenting an accurate assessment of military reality, Hitler refusing to accept that reality, the dismissal of the commander who had told the truth. After the war, Reinhardt was tried and convicted in the German High Command trial, receiving a sentence of 15 years. He was released in 1952 and died in 1963. His case, and the cases of so many commanders like him, raises the question that perhaps defines the ultimate limits of the what-if scenario we are exploring. Even if German professional military judgment had been fully implemented from 1940 onward, would it have been sufficient? At some point, the fundamental imbalance of resources between Germany and the Alliance ranged against it would have asserted itself regardless of the quality of German military management. The Soviet Union's population was approximately 3 times Germany's. The combined industrial output of the Soviet Union, Britain and the United States was eventually vastly greater than Germany's. Professional military skill can compensate for material inferiority up to a point, but it cannot compensate for it indefinitely. The honest answer to the question of whether professional military management would have produced a German victory is almost certainly no, at least if we define victory as the complete conquest of the Soviet Union and the establishment of German hegemony over the Eurasian continent. The resources required for that outcome were simply beyond Germany's reach, regardless of the quality of its military management. But a different kind of victory, a negotiated peace that preserved Germany's 1939 or even 1940 borders, a forced stalemate that left Germany in control of its conquests, was at various points in the war a realistic possibility that Hitler's interference foreclosed. The critical window was almost certainly the autumn of 1941. If German forces had driven to Moscow with the concentrated effort that professional military judgment recommended and had taken the city before winter, The political shock to the Soviet system might have been sufficient to force Stalin to the negotiating table or to trigger the kind of internal political collapse that some German planners had anticipated. Stalin's behavior in the days following the German invasion, when he apparently withdrew into paralysis and near breakdown for several days, suggests a man whose hold on power was dependent on projecting an image of invincibility. The fall of Moscow would have represented a public challenge to that image of potentially historic proportions. We will never know if Stalin would have collapsed, negotiated, or, as some historians argue, simply moved the capital to Kuybyshev and continued the war from there. What we do know is that Hitler's decision to divert forces from the Moscow axis in August 1941 foreclosed the possibility of finding out. The professional military consensus, expressed by Brauchitsch, Halder, Bock, Guderian, and virtually every senior commander involved, was that the Moscow objective was paramount and that the August diversion was a strategic mistake of the first order. History has not produced evidence that this professional consensus was wrong. The second critical window was the period from the spring of 1943 through the summer of 1943, following the Stalingrad disaster. By this point, Germany was clearly on the defensive in the east, but the Red Army's offensive capabilities were not yet fully developed, and the Wehrmacht still retained significant combat power. A professionally managed defense, conducted with the strategic flexibility that the generals had been arguing for throughout the campaign, might have stabilized a front line considerably further east than the front that actually existed when Germany surrendered 2 years later. The debate within the German command about how to handle the Kursk salient in the summer of 1943 is a perfect microcosm of this issue. Manstein wanted to attack the Kursk salient immediately in the spring of 1943, before the Soviets had fully consolidated their positions and built up their defensive preparations. Hitler delayed the operation until July, insisting on waiting for the arrival of new Tiger tanks and Panther tanks that he believed would provide a decisive technological advantage. By July, the Soviets had built one of the deepest defensive systems in military history, with multiple echelons of trenches, minefields, and anti-tank positions. The German attack at Kursk failed with enormous losses in men and equipment that Germany could not replace. Manstein believed that an attack in April or May would have succeeded. He may have been right. He certainly would have faced a far less prepared defense. After Kursk, the initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviets, and the question shifted from whether Germany could win to how long Germany could resist defeat. Even here, professional military management would have made a difference, not in the ultimate outcome, but in the costs imposed on both sides and in the timing of German collapse. The series of German catastrophes in 1944, beginning with the Bagration disaster that destroyed Army Group Centre in June and July, and continuing through the collapse in France following the Normandy breakout, represented the simultaneous failure of the strategy that Hitler had imposed against professional military advice on multiple fronts simultaneously. Let us now consider what the longer-term trajectory might have looked like in the alternate history where the generals ran the war. The scenario most consistent with what the professional military recommended would have produced something like the following sequence of events. In the summer of 1941, German forces drive directly toward Moscow with concentrated armoured power, maintaining momentum through September and October without the August diversion. Whether or not Moscow falls, the damage to the Soviet command and logistics system is severe enough to prevent the kind of winter counteroffensive that actually occurred in December 1941. The German front line in the east stabilizes along defensible positions with shorter supply lines before winter arrives. German forces have not been destroyed in the desperate crisis of December 1941, and the experienced commanders who were dismissed following that crisis, Brauchitsch, Bock, Guderian, and others, remain in their positions. In 1942, with the front stabilized and planning being directed by experienced professionals, the summer offensive is concentrated on a single decisive objective rather than the two-pronged overreach that actually occurred. The Sixth Army is not sacrificed at Stalingrad. German forces either capture Stalingrad quickly and move on, or bypass it entirely in favour of the Caucasus oil fields, which would represent a genuine strategic prize that could partially offset Germany's chronic fuel shortage. The Soviet counteroffensive in November 1942, which actually encircled the Sixth Army, finds a German front that is not overextended and is held by forces that have not been exhausted by months of brutal urban fighting. the encirclement does not occur, or if a Soviet offensive achieves some success, the German response is a professional withdrawal to a prepared defensive line rather than a suicidal stand ordered by a politically obsessed leader. By 1943, Germany is still losing the war in the fundamental sense that the balance of resources continues to shift against it. But it has not suffered the catastrophic losses at Stalingrad, it has not experienced the comprehensive defeat at Kursk that followed Hitler's insisted delay, and it retains a significantly more powerful and experienced military force than it actually possessed at that point. Whether this is sufficient to produce a negotiated peace depends on factors beyond Germany's control, primarily on whether the Allied leadership, particularly Churchill and Roosevelt, would have been willing to negotiate with a Germany that had not yet been decisively defeated. Given their stated war aims and their political commitments, this is genuinely uncertain. But it is not impossible that a Germany still capable of sustained military resistance, and which had removed the most monstrous aspects of the Nazi regime through the kind of internal coup that the July 20th conspirators actually attempted, might have achieved a negotiated outcome in 1943 or 1944. The moral dimensions of this scenario must again be confronted directly. A Germany that survived until 1943 or 1944 with its military intact was also a Germany that was continuing to implement the Holocaust during those additional months and years. The death camps of Operation Reinhard at Treblinka, Sobibor and Belzec operated primarily in 1942. Auschwitz-Birkenau reached the peak of its murderous operations in 1944. A Germany that fought more effectively was also a Germany that could continue implementing the final solution for longer. This is the inescapable moral weight that presses on any positive assessment of what the German generals might have achieved. Their professional competence deployed in service of a regime committed to genocide was not a positive good, even when it produced militarily efficient outcomes. The post-war careers of the surviving German generals and their relationship to these moral questions vary enormously. Some, like Manstein, maintained until the end of their lives that they had been soldiers doing their professional duty and had been unaware of or unable to prevent the crimes committed in the name of the regime they served. Others made more honest accounting of their complicity. The historical verdict on most of them is that they knew more than they admitted, that their professional capacity to have done more to resist or obstruct criminal orders was greater than they acknowledged, and that their post-war claims of ignorance or powerlessness served their own interest in avoiding accountability more than they served historical truth. Wilhelm List, who commanded Army Group A during the German invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece, and later during Case Blue, is a figure who embodies this uncomfortable complexity. After the First World War, like many officers, List remained in the reduced Reichswehr, helping to modernize Germany's military under the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. With the outbreak of World War II, he played a key role in the German invasion of Poland in 1939. His success in this operation earned him Hitler's favor, and by 1940 he was promoted to Field Marshal. One of his most notable assignments was leading German forces during the Balkan Campaign in 1941. He commanded Army Group A, which was crucial in the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. However, List's involvement in the Balkans connects him to the darker aspects of the war. The region saw brutal repression, mass executions, and harsh reprisals against partisans and civilians. While the extent of his personal involvement in these atrocities is debated, his position as a commanding officer inevitably links him to the war crimes committed by German forces under his command. In 1942, List's career ended abruptly during Case Blue. Tasked with capturing the vital oil fields in the Caucasus, his forces faced logistical challenges and strong Soviet resistance. When the operation faltered, Hitler dismissed List from command. After his dismissal, List never returned to active duty. He was later arrested by Allied forces and tried in the hostages trial, where German generals were prosecuted for war crimes in the Balkans. List was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1948, but was released in 1953 due to ill health. However, he continued to live for 19 more years, passing away on August 17, 1971, at the age of 91. His long survival after the war, living into old age in relative comfort, struck many survivors of his campaigns as a profound failure of justice. There is one more figure whose story must be examined before we can draw our conclusions, and that is Claus von Stauffenberg, who is not primarily a figure of military operations, but who represents in the most direct possible form the answer to the question of what should have been done. Stauffenberg had served as a staff officer in various commands, had been severely wounded in North Africa in 1943, losing his right hand, 2 fingers of his left hand, and his left eye, and had come through that experience with a hardened conviction that Hitler had to be removed. He was the man who placed the bomb under the map table in the Wolf's Lair conference room on July 20th, 1944, who flew back to Berlin believing that Hitler was dead, and who began implementing the Operation Valkyrie plan to seize control of the German government before learning that Hitler had survived. Stauffenberg's willingness to act, in contrast to the many senior commanders who recognized the disaster of Hitler's direction but could not bring themselves to take the step into active resistance, tells us something important about the relationship between professional military judgment and moral courage. He represents the answer that military professionalism, in its highest form, demanded, but that most of his colleagues could not provide. The failure of the conspiracy was not a failure of will on his part. He did everything in his power and paid for it with his life, shot in the Bendler Block courtyard with 3 co-conspirators in the early hours of July 21st, 1944. The failure was of circumstance and of the inadequate number of professional military men who were willing to follow where he led. The legacy of the July 20th conspiracy for the post-war German military is profound. The officers who formed the conspiracy and who died for it became the moral foundation on which the post-war West German military, the Bundeswehr, chose to build its institutional identity. In a military tradition that had much to answer for, the conspirators represented the moment when professional military judgment and moral courage had come together in the clearest possible form. The Bundeswehr's founding documents explicitly invoked the tradition of July 20th as its moral inheritance, deliberately choosing to identify with the resistors rather than with the loyalists. What would Germany have looked like if the July 20th conspiracy had succeeded? If Hitler had been killed and a conservative government formed under Beck and Stauffenberg and their collaborators, the conspirators planned to immediately seek negotiations with the Western Allies, offering to withdraw German forces from the occupied territories in the West in exchange for an armistice that would allow Germany to continue the war against the Soviet Union in the East. This proposal would have been deeply problematic for Churchill and Roosevelt, both of whom were committed to unconditional surrender, and both of whom would have faced enormous domestic political pressure not to negotiate with any German government that had the blood of the occupied populations on its hands. But it is possible that the war in the West might have ended significantly earlier than May 1945, if the German government had been willing and able to offer a genuine withdrawal. The Eastern Front scenario is more complex. The conspirators' hope was that a German front stabilized at the 1941 or 1942 borders, combined with Western Allied pressure for a negotiated peace, might have produced a settlement that preserved Germany from Soviet occupation. This hope was almost certainly unrealistic, given Stalin's political requirements and his determination to ensure that Germany could never again threaten the Soviet Union. But it might have produced a faster end to the killing on both sides and potentially a different and better outcome than the one that actually occurred. The question we have been asking throughout this video, what if Hitler had let his generals run the war after 1940, does not have a simple or comfortable answer. The generals were extraordinary professionals who were systematically prevented from applying their professional skills by a military political command system that placed absolute authority in the hands of a man whose military instincts, though occasionally brilliant in 1940, became progressively more disconnected from military reality as the war continued. The accumulating disaster of Hitler's interventions, the failure to capture Moscow in 1941, the Stalingrad catastrophe, the Kursk delay, the rigid hold, orders that destroyed garrison after garrison, the dismissal of commanders who told the truth, all of these represent a systematic corruption of professional military judgment that made German defeat not merely likely but inevitable. At the same time, the generals who might have run the war differently were not the morally admirable figures of post-war mythology. They served a criminal regime, they transmitted criminal orders, they cooperated with the SS in the occupied territories, they maintained their professional careers by accommodating themselves to a political system that was committing crimes on a scale unprecedented in modern history. The professional competence that might have saved more German soldiers was deployed in service of an ideology that was murdering millions of civilian victims. These two things are not separate. They are the same historical reality viewed from different angles. The answer that emerges from this examination is not that the German generals were the good guys constrained by a bad leader. It is that professional military competence and political and moral recklessness are a particularly dangerous combination, because the competence enables the recklessness to achieve results that it could not achieve on its own. Germany's astonishing military victories of 1939 and 1940 were genuine achievements of professional military art. They were also the enablement of everything that followed. The Holocaust, the murderous occupation of Eastern Europe, the starvation of millions of Soviet prisoners of war, the destruction of entire populations designated as racially inferior. The generals made all of that possible by doing their professional jobs well. The tragedy of the German officer corps in World War II is not simply that they were constrained by a bad leader from doing their professional jobs. It is that doing their professional jobs well in the service of the regime they served was itself a moral catastrophe, and that the highest expression of their professional identity, the July 20th conspiracy, came too late and failed. The answer to the question of what would have happened if the generals had run the war after 1940 is that it would have been a better war from Germany's military perspective and a worse one from humanity's moral perspective. Germany would have fought more effectively. The regime that was fighting that war more effectively would have continued, in parallel with that fighting, to implement one of history's worst crimes. Professional military competence in this case was not a moral good. It was a moral complication. General Siegfried Westphal, the high-ranking German officer, who once remarked of the British that the hardest, toughest in attack, and most persistent in defence were the British divisions, offered this tribute because he was a professional assessing professionals. The Germans reserved their highest respect for those who fought as they fought, with skill, with discipline, and with an understanding of what they were doing and why. That quality of professional assessment, turned inward toward Germany's own military management, is what the July 20th conspirators had in common with the broader tradition of the German officer corps. They could see clearly what was happening. Most of them could not act. A few of them could and did and paid for it. Franz Halder, who survived the war in Dachau concentration camp and went on to become a major source for American historians' understanding of the German army, lived to see the post-war reconstruction of Germany and the founding of the Bundeswehr. He had spent the war arguing, mostly unsuccessfully, that professional military judgment should prevail over political interference. He had watched the consequences of his arguments being overruled. His assessment, offered in the quiet of post-war reflection, was that Germany's military defeat had been primarily the product of Hitler's interventions, and that the professional military had fought as well as any force in history under the constraints it faced. Whether one fully accepts that assessment or not, it captures something real about the tension between professional competence and political interference that defines the German military experience of World War II, and that remains relevant wherever military professionals and political leaders must find ways to work together without either subordinating themselves entirely to the other. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. The question of what the German generals might have achieved if given professional autonomy is one of history's great what-ifs, and we have barely scratched the surface of the evidence and arguments available. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to Germany's top field marshals after World War II. It dives deep into the post-war fates of these remarkable and troubling figures. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one. The question of logistics deserves specific attention as we think about what professional military management would have changed, because logistics was the area where Hitler's interference was perhaps most consistently and most concretely damaging. The German army's logistical system in 1939 and 1940 was genuinely excellent, designed by professionals who understood that an army's ability to fight depends entirely on its ability to receive fuel, ammunition, food, and replacements at the rate required by operations. The logistical planning for the French campaign, conducted under Brauchitsch and Halder, reflected this professional understanding and was one of the reasons the campaign succeeded so spectacularly. From 1941 onward, Hitler's operational demands consistently outpaced the logistical capacity of the German army. The decision to attack the Soviet Union in 1941 was itself logistically questionable, as the German army had not fully recovered from the demands of the Western campaigns and had not been given the time to rebuild its vehicle and equipment stocks. The overextension of German forces in the autumn of 1941, driving far beyond the logistical reach of their supply lines in the race to capture Moscow before winter, was a direct consequence of Hitler's insistence on maximum advance regardless of logistical reality. The vehicles that were supposed to carry fuel and ammunition to the frontline units were, instead themselves, running out of fuel in the vast distances of the Russian steppe. Professional military management would have imposed logistical constraints on operational planning from the beginning. Brauchitsch and Halder's preferred approach to Barbarossa recognized that the German army could advance at a sustainable rate, or it could advance at a maximum rate, but not both simultaneously. And that maximum advance without logistics was not actually advance, but rather overextension. Their recommendation for a concentrated advance along a single main axis was partly a recognition that concentrating forces meant concentrating logistical support as well, which would have allowed faster sustainable advance along that axis than the three-axis simultaneous advance that was actually undertaken. The fuel shortage that plagued German armoured operations throughout the war was both a symptom of strategic overextension and an independent constraint that professional management would have addressed more effectively. German tank engines consumed fuel at rates that the German oil industry, dependent on Romanian oil from Ploiești and synthetic fuel from German factories that were increasingly targeted by Allied bombing, struggled to provide. Rommel's repeated complaints about fuel shortages in North Africa were not simply logistical failures. They were the consequence of strategic decisions made at the highest level about the priority to be given to the African theatre versus other theatres. A professional command that had decided North Africa was the decisive theatre would have ensured it received adequate fuel. Hitler's command, which treated North Africa as a secondary theatre that nevertheless demanded German military glory, ensured that neither North Africa nor the Eastern Front received adequate priority. The synthetic oil production program that Germany pursued during the war was itself a testament to professional military foresight, as it had been developed precisely because professional military planners recognized Germany's vulnerability to an oil embargo. But the bombing of the synthetic oil plants by the Allied strategic bombing campaign from mid-1944 onward created fuel shortages so severe that German armoured and air forces were increasingly immobilized by lack of fuel in the final year of the war. Professional management would have recognized this vulnerability earlier and would have invested more heavily in the dispersal and protection of these critical facilities. The concentrated industrial infrastructure that made German war production efficient also made it vulnerable, and the decision to defend it rather than disperse it was another example of short-term production efficiency taking precedence over long-term strategic resilience. The role of intelligence in German military operations is another area where professional management would likely have produced better results. The German intelligence services were divided between multiple competing organizations: the Abwehr under Canaris, the SD under Schellenberg, and various military intelligence staffs, and their product was frequently contradictory, filtered through political considerations, and ultimately inadequate to the demands of the war. Hitler's tendency to dismiss intelligence assessments that contradicted his preconceptions and to reward the presentation of information that confirmed what he already believed created systematic intelligence failures throughout the war. The most catastrophic of these was the consistent underestimation of Soviet industrial and military capacity. German intelligence had underestimated the number of Soviet tank and aircraft production facilities, had not adequately assessed the Soviet capacity to relocate production east of the Urals, and had consistently provided Hitler with analyses of Soviet military reserves that were less than the actual figures. When the true scale of Soviet production became apparent in 1942 and 1943, with new Soviet tank and aircraft models appearing in quantities that German planners had deemed impossible, it was too late to adjust German strategy to the reality. Professional military intelligence, conducted with analytical integrity rather than shaped by political requirements, would have provided a more accurate assessment of what Germany was actually up against, and that more accurate assessment might have produced more realistic strategic choices from the beginning. The relationship between the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS throughout the war also illuminates the tensions within German military management. The Waffen-SS, Hitler's ideological military force, grew from a few divisions in 1940 to a force of nearly 40 divisions by 1945. Its units received priority in equipment, personnel, and supplies that the regular army resented deeply. The professional army's objections to this arrangement were partly professional snobbery about the SS's initially lower standards of training and partly a genuinely accurate assessment that the resources being diverted to the Waffen-SS could be used more effectively if distributed to the experienced professional units of the regular army. As the war progressed and the Waffen-SS developed its own experienced officers and battle-tested units, the professional quality gap narrowed considerably, but the resource allocation distortion remained throughout the war. A professionally managed German military would not have tolerated this parallel structure because the resource inefficiency it produced was militarily unjustifiable. The political reasons for the Waffen-SS's privileged position, its role as a guarantor of Nazi political power and as a potential counterbalance to army independence, were entirely political and entirely contrary to military efficiency. Every litre of fuel, every tank, every artillery piece that went to a Waffen-SS unit because of its political status rather than its military priority was a resource that could have been better used elsewhere in purely military terms. The Waffen-SS's role in the worst war crimes of the occupation also creates a specific military problem that a professional command would have recognized and sought to address. The atrocities committed by SS units, even when militarily motivated in the sense of representing reprisals for partisan activities, consistently produced counterproductive military results by swelling the ranks of resistance movements, alienating potentially cooperative populations, and creating intelligence environments in which the German occupiers were surrounded by enemies rather than managing subject populations. A professional military assessment of occupation policy would have recognized that brutality was tactically counterproductive, even in purely military terms, and would have sought to restrict it. The fact that occupation policy was ultimately driven by ideological requirements rather than military assessment is itself a demonstration of what happened when political considerations overrode professional judgment. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 was in some respects the culmination of a process that had begun years earlier, as professional military judgment was systematically overridden by political interference and as the commanders who insisted on professional integrity were dismissed, imprisoned, or killed. Karl Dönitz, who signed the surrender as Hitler's designated successor, directed the process as efficiently and professionally as the disastrous circumstances allowed. His aim was to save as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from Soviet captivity by surrendering to Western Allied forces first and surrendering in the East as late as possible. This was, in its way, a final act of professional military management in an impossible situation, extracting the best possible outcome from terrible circumstances through careful timing and professional execution. The German soldiers who surrendered in May 1945 were the survivors of a military force that had been extraordinary in its professional capabilities and catastrophic in its political direction. They had fought for 6 years across Europe, North Africa, and the Atlantic. They had won victories that would be studied in military academies for generations and suffered defeats that resulted directly from the overruling of the professional judgment that had produced those victories. The contrast between what they had been capable of and what they had been made to do in service of a criminal regime is one of the most troubling aspects of modern military history. Their professional excellence did not redeem their service did not negate their excellence. Both things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them is what makes the story of the German generals in World War II so enduringly significant.